Alright, y'all. So this is going to be the AF-Util topic analysis for the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes. I apologize for the slight delay in rollout. I had a lot of schoolwork over the last half week that prevented me from doing this on time. But let's get into it. I'm super excited for this topic. I think that it's a pretty decent topic in terms of depth of research and the quality of the literature. And I think there's, especially from an AF perspective, there's a lot of flexible ground we can explore that lends itself both toward, your traditional util policy AFs, but also different types of AFs with more creative framing that we can obviously explore as the topic develops. So once again, as goes with all these topic analyses, this is just a starting point. What I've been able to discern from the few days of research I've had on this and the few cards I've cut. Obviously, this is not the be-all, end-all toward all research, but just a starting point for you to think about AF research on this topic. So here's a general overview on this topic. So on this topic, whenever you're thinking about a specific type of AF, you need to think about how you're planning about establishing a strong link turn against regional generic disads. So, for example, if you want to write an AF that says, remove the military aid we give to, say, Saudi Arabia, something you need to think about is, we give military aid to Saudi Arabia for a reason, and that's mostly to secure good relations, but also to pursue some U.S. security objectives in the Middle East, notably to counterbalance against Iranian regional influence. So something you need to think about then is what's our answer to the Saudi pro-lift disad? What's our answer to the potential oil prices DA? Those are the things you need to think about. In general, I would think that an AF that just is worded to say, plan, the United States ought not provide military aid to Saudi Arabia, isn't the most strategic AF. And so, those AFs, especially the Saudi Arabia one, will be the easiest to find because they're in the news a lot and a lot of people have spilled a lot of ink about this. That doesn't necessarily make it the best AF. The best AF on this topic is going to be one that can have a really solid foundation for a mechanism that, hopefully lends itself to pretty good advantages, but more importantly, hedges highly against the sort of policy generics that people can research and cut. Because just as the research that goes in favor of ending military aid, or that is critical of military aid to those countries, is that the opposition to that position, i.e. research supporting providing continued military aid, is just as strong. So you want to make sure that when thinking about an AF, what the 1AR on a lot of these positions is going to be. I think the second thing to think about is the aid key to your impact? For example, what's your answer to the increased development aid counterplan, or to more tricky counterplans like threaten to withhold the aid but don't actually withdraw the aid counterplan? This is important to think about because you want to make sure that the mechanism you're pursuing and the advantages you're trying to get are intrinsically tied to ending provision of military aid. Otherwise, the neg can easily just counterplan out of it and have a disad to withdrawing aid writ large. I think the other thing you want to think about is how do you address the larger sort of U.S. hegemony / Russia-China fill-in arguments, because one of the potential neg arguments is that, of course, that if the U.S. were to withdraw its military aid, Russia and China would simply fill in. So when thinking about the mechanism you're pursuing, you want to think about, would Russia and China be able to fill in? For instance, China doesn't generally pursue a ton of military engagement with other countries. For example, they have one foreign military base, and it's in Djibouti. But what they do is a ton of economic engagement, infrastructure development with countries in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. And so that is something to think about. It's also possible, of course, for us to impact turn these. There's reasons as there's people who would write as to why a sort of peaceful rise of China unimpeded by U.S. militarization would potentially be good. And I think the last just sort of trip up that you need to think about is just T ought not. The how ought not plays into the rest of that topic is a little unclear, given that that seems to be the like that and generic bare plural nouns seem to be the only real constraints on what degree the AF can specify and what exactly the AF is allowed to say. I don't think it's something that's worth like a ton of time thinking about, but it's something that you want to make sure that like you have incorporated. So in line with some of my previous AF UTLTAs, I'm going to talk about topicality a little bit first. So this is the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index from 2017. This isn't like the be-all, end-all list of authoritarian regimes, but it's like it's a pretty good shorthand for determining whether or not a country that you're providing military aid to is authoritarian or not. And I think this brings up the first trickiness of this AF util area, which is just to what degree do we count an AF topical in realms of it being an authoritarian regime? And does a country that has authoritarian elements count as an authoritarian regime? I would personally lean on that question no. Like, the phrase authoritarian regime is distinct from authoritarianism writ large, which means that the AFs that you could potentially write are probably a lot more constrained, given that, you know, the number of authoritarian regimes in the world writ large in the last few decades has, on general, been going down. And as you can see, most of the authoritarian regimes are concentrated in Africa, the Middle East, and certain parts of Southeast Asia. So, in terms of military aid, which seems to be besides ought not, it seems to be one of the more the end authoritarian regimes, is the other important limiting factor on this resolution. So I know that y'all have been having a lot of Slack conversations about this, and we've like bandied a lot about the what military aid can encompass. I've cut a few T cards on it. I've looked at some of the ones that the other coaches have cut, and it seems the consensus that's being arrived at is that military aid means foreign military financing and training assistance. So foreign military financing includes things like supporting peacekeeping operations in other countries, supporting counter-narcotics operations in other countries, military construction, which I take to mean as like military capacity building, so helping build military infrastructure for other countries, and then the final thing being like money to purchase U.S. weapons. So unfortunately, it seems that forward presence isn't necessarily topical. I think so we've discussed like forward deployed military presence that the United States has in other countries as a potential AF. I don't think withdrawing foreign military presence is topical per se, but there's probably definitely literature about how certain forms of U.S. forward deployed troops overseas provide this sort of military aid to authoritarian regimes, especially in the realm of military training and potential certain cooperation issues on certain things like counter-terror or counter-narcotics operations. But that seems to be the consensus definition for military aid. So I'm just going to talk through a couple regions that are sort of I think going to be the most salient ones in this topic. So the first one is Africa. If you recall from that map a few slides ago, most of the African continent has what are considered various degrees of authoritarian or mixed hybrid regimes, which means that it is like a hotbed for this topic, and there are probably lots of solvency advocates in this area. So just from my background knowledge, I know that there are current UN peacekeeping operations in the Central African Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, both of which are looking to prevent imminent civil wars and genocides by trying to keep the peace and encourage peaceful engagement between various belligerents in those countries. I also know from research that the U.S. supports training of African troops in Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi at the very least through AFRICOM, or African Command, which is like a centralized military command for the African continent that the United States has established, and it's sort of the military organization through which like all major operational decisions are filtered and executed. So I think in the Africa area, the most salient issues are issues of mixing of the main issue is the mixing of counterterror, military, humanitarian, and development objectives. What this means is that we have a bunch of military assistance in Africa. We have overseas troops there. We maintain certain bases there. We provide assistance in the forms of financing for both peacekeeping operations through multilateral institutions like the United Nations, as well as directly to African Union countries. And what ends up happening is that with that military assistance, it's expected that they have to accomplish multiple goals. Like they're expected to not only provide security assurances, but also to increase development, as well as carry out certain humanitarian objectives such as disease prevention and disaster response, and which begs the question of like whether or not militarized combat units should be doing those missions. So I think that would be a really cool area of research for this topic area. I also think that and I'll mention this at the very end when I talk about advantage areas writ large, but the issue of democratization and the sort of moral hazard that U.S. military aid causes in terms of a regime's willingness to democratize and sort of move away from authoritarianism would also be a pretty solid foundation for research. The next region we want to focus on is the Middle East. This has obviously been in the news a lot with the murder of the journalist named Khashoggi. If most of you have likely heard about this, it was in the news a bunch last month. And if you hadn't heard about it, well, it'll only take a few Google searches to get briefed. So we also saw from that EIU slide that a lot of there are still a lot of regimes in the Middle East that are classified as authoritarian. The most salient of whom is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, whom the United States has provided extensive military assistance over the last 70 or so years. We're currently helping them with their intervention in the Yemeni civil war, which is an act that we have assigned out, and has pretty good implications. It has pretty good advantage areas in terms of both counterterrorism issues as well as regional stability in the Middle East as a result of U.S. military aid. So I think the focus here especially is going to be on the sort of international security dynamics of the Middle East. And I'll send out a reading later about the Iranian-Saudi Arabian geopolitical rivalry, which shapes a lot of Middle Eastern international relations, which I think that if y'all want to be like well read on this issue, on this region of the topic, then you should definitely check out. Of course, the U.S. military assistance to Saudi Arabia is entangled with a lot of things, one of which I've written down here is obviously the issue of whether or not Saudi Arabia would be tempted to proliferate nuclear weapons if the U.S. withdraws its security assurances, especially in the face of what is at this point a Iran deal that may potentially be on the brink of falling out. And if it does, Iranian nuclearization would all but guarantee Saudi nuclearization, especially absent U.S. military assurances. The other two countries I have listed here are countries that both deserve a question mark after them, because I'm not sure sort of the direction they would have / topicality issues. So for Syria, obviously there's the Assad regime, which definitely counts as an authoritarian regime that is waging a civil war right now. The main problem with the Syria AF is that, of course, we don't provide aid to Assad. We have more or less taken a position against Assad and carried out strikes against his WMD facilities. and rather in the last few years we were funneling aid to the rebels that were fighting against Assad. But there's potential AF ground here. Not sure what it would be yet, or at the very least, it's something that's worth researching. For the Iran issue, this gets to an issue of what is military aid, because this brings back the question of sort of what to do with regarding economic sanctions on Iran. So just like a brief backgrounder, where in response to the Iranian nuclearization program, the United States imposed a lot of economic sanctions on Iran, which were lifted in 2015 in return for a deal with the Iranians that the Iranians promised to sort of dismantle their nuclear weapons facilities and not enrich uranium to weapons-grade material. So this begs the question of how expansive the definition of military aid is, and this is a weird situation in which not doing an action could conceivably be construed as military aid, since sanctions were sort of the U.S. foreign policy tool to try to punish Iran for attempting to nuclearize. But besides these four countries that I've listed here, I'm sure there are plenty of other instances or particular countries that we could research in addition to this. But I think the overall issues and themes to think about in the context of the Middle East are regional security dynamics, as well as great power influence from China, Russia, and the United States, and of course the issue of terrorism/counterterrorism in the region broadly. The last region I want to talk about is Latin America, and really the only salient issue here is the war on drugs/counter-narcotics operations. If we pursue an AF in this area, the main things to think about is how do we answer the domestic legalization counterplan, so fixing the issue from the demand side rather than the supply side, and also authoritarian regimes. I forgot what exactly the EIU map indicated, but it seemed to me that a lot of Latin American regimes aren't classified as authoritarian, which sort of begs the question then if any topical AF could actually solve. There is a potential one involving Venezuela, but the U.S. has already sanctioned the Venezuelan regime, the Maduro regime in Venezuela, so that seems to be sort of out of the question. The Brazil area could potentially be interesting given the election of Bolsonaro last month, but it could be tricky given that Brazil is a pretty full-fledged democracy, and that, sure, they elected a guy who espouses a lot of authoritarian ideas, but he hasn't shaped the country in a way yet that makes it authoritarian. Okay, so the last slide here is just going to be the main advantage areas to think about that I've sort of broken down a little bit by category. First is world security. So these are just like hard military issues involving counterterrorism. This is mostly, of course, in Africa and the Middle East. And then sort of conflict management and stability, both in the Middle East with the Iranian-Saudi geopolitical rivalry, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have a lot of regional tension, especially around the area of the Congo, which has historically been home to some of the bloodiest wars in Africa, as well as issues of potential disease outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of research which indicates that potential zoonotic infections, the likely point at which they would emerge is in sub-Saharan Africa. So a potential advantage to research is the capacity of countries to be able to respond, and whether or not U.S. military assists or hinders that capacity. The other areas involve economic issues, so issues of regional development, which is sort of intimately tied with sort of the nature of regimes in the area, and of course whether or not democracies are correlated with larger economies, and also with the whole issue of whether or not providing military aid creates a sort of moral hazard for authoritarian regimes to continue to do messed up things to their own populations to hold on to power with the security assurance of the United States behind them. The other two things that I think are worth thinking about are issues of soft power and the overall role of the U.S. in the liberal international order, especially that first issue of soft power, which gets to the issue, of course, of Russian and Chinese fill-in. I think in the issue of soft power, the more salient contrast is China. And something to think about is just sort of like, is a militarized approach what the United States wants to be doing? And this gets into an issue of like a question that we should try to answer is, does U.S. military aid crowd out other forms of non-military aid? So of course, like, the NEG may respond saying that like we should just increase development aid to these countries. But I think a really smart AF would have researched the issue of that continued presence of military aid inherently crowds out or makes development aid ineffective, and therefore that the AF is specifically key to enabling those things, which I think would be a smart way to get at these impacts and be able to hedge against a lot of NEG generics. So those are my thoughts on the AF util area. Once again, this is only meant to be a starting point. Y'all should, of course, research things like continue to find research paths outside of everything I've suggested here. And of course, if you have any questions about any of this, contact me over Slack.